Just Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Yes, hello again and welcome to episode 107 of Imagine Theatre's podcast series, and this time we're going to discuss the theatre and pantomime convention of cross-dressing with the author Janet Tennant.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
In the last episode, we were at the official opening of the new Imagine headquarters, Trafalgar House in Coventry. If you missed it, you can still check it out, along with all of the other previous episodes, and don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss out in the future. So far in the series, we've spoken to stars of the pantomime stage, various creative team members, and many, many more. We've looked at specific titles, explored all of the elements that make a panto work, and we've celebrated panto success at 3 consecutive UK Pantomime Awards ceremonies. Well, this time, we're going to discuss the pantomime convention of cross-dressing, something you can trace right the way back to the earliest forms of theatre. And joining me is the author of the fabulous book, It's a Drag, Cross-Dressing in Performance, Janet Tennant. How are you?
Very well, thank you. It's nice to be here.
I have to say, you should be in a good mood. You've just returned from Vienna, haven't you?
Yes, it was wonderful.
So let's talk about the history first of all, because as I said, you can trace cross-dressing in performance right the way back to the earliest forms of theatre, Greek theatre in particular.
The Greek theatre, it had to be men because women weren't allowed on stage. So we had, right up to the Restoration here, men were on the stage, but it was boys mainly as it got towards the Shakespearean period. But the Greeks and the Romans, always men. Women were in the background, obviously helping out, but it was always men on stage. And they had the stronger voices. It was masks, and rather than in any way attempting to play a role, they wore masks to designate sadness, cheerfulness, anything that they were supposed to be displaying was on the mask rather than the acting. It was delivery. And they had masks which had to be very careful because, of course, they couldn't see on stage in many cases, the Greeks and the Romans. So they had to have gaps in the ears with the hair hanging over the ears so they could negotiate their way around the stages. And then we had, of course, the Shakespearean side of it, the boys on stage. And it was boys, it wasn't men. Men very rarely played women in Shakespearean or before the Restoration. The only real men on stage were probably something like the witches in Macbeth. But other than that, it was boys, and boys which were very highly trained, very controlled. Their voices were trained, their bodies were trained. They had these very complicated costumes. Very expensive.
There is a contrast there because, of course, boys playing female roles there, but when pantomime dames first originated, and to this day, very often, they're played by older men. But There are some similarities in panto terms because, of course, you could argue that the makeup that dames use today and sometimes other characters are very similar to the masks from Greek theatre in that they're, elaborate and larger than life.
Larger than life, and they are meant to demonstrate the sort of person that person is at the time, rather than any real attempt to act the part as such. Although I think that pantomime dames are far more nuanced than the Greek or Romans were.
Well, they certainly are now. And, you talk about Elizabethan theatre, throughout Shakespeare's times, boys playing the female roles and so on. At no stage have we seen at any point females playing male roles yet.
And not at that stage, no. At Restoration, when the Restoration came, when Charles II came back to the throne and women went on the stage, it wasn't long before they started playing male roles. A lot of the roles that were available, the strong roles, the Shakespearean roles, the roles in comedy, were male roles. So although they played, obviously, themselves most of the time, there were quite a few women who chose to play male roles. For example, Nell Gwyn. She was often dressed as a man in disguise terms, as was Moll Davis, who was a dancer. But they had good legs, of course. I mean, sex sold. Women dressed as men were extremely sexy. And of course, that's led in to some extent to the principal boy, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, people were critical of the sexualization of women through that role. There was no way that they were trying to disguise the fact they were women with the
No,
costumes that they had, the tights or stockings and so on, and the makeup and everything. They
they
were
were
obviously
emphasizing
women,
it.
weren't they?
Yeah, they were emphasizing the fact they were women. And that was true the most, I think, of the actresses after the Restoration. It was very much sex sells, and some of the prologues to the plays at the time, post Restoration, were in effect inviting men to go back and examine the fact that these people were not men but women. I mean, it was extremely sexualized.
By the time we get to the 19th century, a lot of things have changing. We saw a real flourishing of male impersonators, and
Yeah,
there are many names that people might recognize. I'm thinking of people like Hetty King, Ellis Shields, and of course Vesta
that's
Tilley, probably the most
yeah.
famous of all.
Absolutely. And she was amazing. I mean, she could parody and mock the state of maleness. She was, she was comedic, she was could be sentimental, she could be patriotic, she could play the principal boy. She was definitely never ever there was never any doubt she was a woman on stage, and yet she could play quite nuanced male roles and was much loved for it. And her costumes were copied by men and women.
Many of these performers as well were the earliest principal boys, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yeah, Bessa Taylor was one of the earliest principal boys. But I think the interesting thing was how much the music hall gave to the pantomime. It was the expansion of working class women coming on stage and the bawdiness involved. I mean, music hall was bawdy, whereas vaudeville wasn't. America compared to Britain was quite different in the way in which the cross-dressing roles developed.
While this was going on as well, of course, the pantomime dame was developing
Yes.
from the Harlequinade clowns, through to the very first pantomime dames. That was much earlier, though, wasn't it, than the likes of Vesta Tilley as a principal
Oh, yes,
boy?
yes, yes, yes. I think we've got what Grimaldi, was about the 1812-ish, played the first real dame, Queen Ronabelliana.
Grimaldi, definitely the original clown, becoming the pantomime dame, and that was the real origin of the role, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. But as the music halls developed, you had a lot of young women singers and male comedians involved in cross dressing, and a lot of male comedians at that time on the halls had a female cross dressing role in their act and continued it usually in panto.
One man who also developed the pantomime dame role in the Victorian times was another music hall performer called Dan Leno, and he really
Yeah.
started to develop the look of the dame as well, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, there were a couple of them. Yeah, the over-the-top man dressed as a woman. What always fascinates me in this case is how putting a middle-aged man in a dame costume or any other female costume immediately says comedy.
Hmm.
Whereas put a middle-aged woman in a male outfit, and she can be funny, but she has to be funny in her own right rather than visually. And Dan Leno was, the one who started that over the top, colourful fella in a frock.
And the costumes started to become, again, larger than life, colourful, but it was always a sort of matronly, housemaid, motherly sort of character,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yes, yes. Yes, at that time it was, wasn't it? I mean, the shift came later, the shift to the glamour.
And then, of course, dames, as they developed, we know so many famous Norman Evans, Nat Jackley, people like that. They all brought a little bit of their own act to the role as well. So this was where the dame really started to be completely different, depending on the performer. The basis was there that people like Grimaldi and Dan Leno had developed, but dames started to create their own sort of characters with Nat Jackley's funny walk that Billy Dainty then copied, and Norman Evans, gossipy old woman that Les
Yeah.
Dawson then copied. So we really saw a real expansion of the characters, didn't we?
Yes, we saw an expansion in the characters that, as I say, most of the comedians had a dame character, although it wasn't called a dame except at Christmas, in their package of activities. At Christmas, they then became the pantomime dame.
Now, pantomime really was the only area for a time where this cross-dressing continued, because it did become frowned upon. I think Queen Mary, at one particular occasion, if not more than one, would actually hide her eyes when a female male impersonator came on stage because she didn't like it.
Well, that was particularly so with Esther. Yes, she really objected to that and told her all her maids of honor to hide their faces as well, so nobody could look at her. Yeah, she did. The shift came quite slowly, I think. I mean, I think it was. I find it quite interesting how, for example, that it was male impersonators that were popular here, but female impersonators in America. Part of that was due to the attitude towards homosexuality
Hmm.
in the different countries. At the turn of the 20th century, there were an awful lot of female impersonators in America, while we were still far more enthusiastic about the male impersonators. I mean, in America, you had people like Julian Edeltange, who acted in differently with different types of women. He was girly, sophisticated, and he was so classy that he shaved his fingers in his arms. He had a beauty culture. People followed. He had a beauty magazine. I mean, it was amazing. And the idea was that if he as a man could look so good as a woman, then ordinary women, if they used his potions and makeup and dress like him, could be attractive too. I mean, it was quite different. And there were a lot of people like that in America, whereas we had a lack of female impersonation here in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, I
Um,
guess he was an early precursor in this country to people like Daniel LaRue, but that was 50, 60
Absolutely.
years
Yeah.
later.
We have that period, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, where because of, the trial of Oscar Wilde, for example, it was unlikely that you had anybody like that on our stages, except, and if we had a few people like that, what they did was make sure that they had their wives with them or dressed as men. I think even pretended to fight, set up mock fights when they were off stage to prove their masculinity. It was quite different.
So very different than in the early 20th century. It was the Royal Variety show in 1912 that the Queen hid her face from Vesta Tilley. But Principal Boys continued throughout that, and they became more and more sexualized as a role. And the dames were developing at the same time, and they were going in all sorts of different directions. And I'm thinking of characters like Old Mother Riley, for
Oh,
instance,
yes.
which was a music hall come radio, eventually television, Arthur Lucan, of course. But that was a completely different, that was a man playing a granny, wasn't it?
It was very interesting. I remember her. I mean, I'm quite old now, but I remember when I was a kid, tiny little girl, we used to have Old Mother Riley films, the Sunday school treats, etc.
Hmm.
And this poor guy had to put these up for the kids. And she was, she was nobody. She didn't hide her craggy face, or he didn't hide his craggy face. All that Old Mother Riley pretended to be was a washerwoman, an old woman, and no costume except for a very scruffy frock and a silly little hat.
Mm.
There was no makeup, no bust, nothing, quite different than what came later. And yet, Old Mother Riley, he was very popular, and film after film after film.
I think the other interesting thing is that Arthur Lucan was actually joined on stage by, I think it was Kitty McShane, was it? I can't remember the
Yes,
surname.
who was
Who
who
was
was
his wife.
his wife, yes, but she always acted as his daughter on stage.
And that,
At the films.
yeah, that reminds me of in more recent times, the Crankies, of course, where, the wee boy is actually the wife
Is the
of the
wife
man.
of the man, yeah. Oh, yes. For some reason, I never took to them. I don't know. I just couldn't cope with them. It's strange, isn't it? I found that sort of slightly distasteful, and I don't know why. Whereas I found Old Mother Riley perfectly okay.
So, as these roles developed in pantomime, different characters were introduced. Now, I'm thinking going back to Danny LaRue, who started out as one of the ugly sisters, eventually went on to play dames, but then stopped playing dames and was introduced as a different character, a glamorous, because dames were never really glamorous, but Danny
No,
LaRue
no,
was. So, roles were created for people like that.
absolutely. And also, roles were created to support them, where others, sometimes other cross-dressing roles were created. But Danny LaRue could never climb ladders on stage and do pratfalls, could he? So
No.
those sort of activities usually were sidelined or removed to other characters in the pantomime. So you did have the mayhem. You can't really have a pantomime without mayhem, can you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's worth pointing out as well, and we've talked about, the history of cross-dressing and its sort of journey through Elizabethan times and so on. But there are lots of other things that were changing. All of these things came through Commedia dell'arte in many ways, in terms of the clown, the Grimaldi clown, but also clowning in both the circus and clowning in shows like Punch and Judy, for instance. They all go back to Commedia dell'arte. And the interesting thing is, and I didn't realize this until I did some research recently, but there was a trend, and possibly still is, of cross-dressing in the circus, isn't there?
One of the things that I've been reading about is how they think that pantomime is very culturally specific, isn't it? you know, we don't have it anywhere else except where English people live or have settled. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, it has been, yeah, and it's. I think it's a British tradition, but there are Americans have had some pantomimes over there. I mean, its roots in fairy tales actually help when it's, sold to
Yes.
other audiences, but predominantly it's loved by British people wherever they are in the world.
I was reading that the Feast of Fools, the Tudor, I think it was New Year's Eve, they had the Feast of Fools with the Lord of Misrule, with a
Mhm.
lot of role reversal at that stage. And there is a thinking that maybe English people got so used to that that role reversal comes very easily to them.
Yeah, I think you're right, and the fall itself is a link through to the clown and Grimaldi, and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
fall in King Lear through Shakespeare and so on. There are lots of comparable links throughout, I think, aren't there? And also, the Feast of Fools is very similar in what went on to the Roman Bacchanalia festival as well. So we think we've developed, but a lot of these things are actually trends that have carried on historically through time, aren't they?
But they change, but they obviously are changing. I mean, if things weren't to change, we would still have pantomime as mime, wouldn't we? Nobody speaking, or maybe only one speaking character, which was the Harlequin original, wasn't it?
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
before that, it was mime. Things do change. I think one of the things about pantomime is the audience. I was talking to one of our local dames for the book in Lichfield, and he was saying, I was talking to him, why doesn't it work very easily elsewhere? He said, well, if you wanted to introduce it elsewhere, he said they'd enjoy it, they'd enjoy the mayhem, they'd enjoy the activity, but you'd have to take half the audience with you for the first year because how would a how would a French or an Italian or a Spanish audience know to shout he's behind you
Yeah.
or groan the awful jokes, so I do think that culturally specific thing is important.
Conventions in pantomime are really important. The structure of it, I mean, the audience participation is unique in many ways as well. You're absolutely right. But it has developed as an art form. And, we're
Mm,
seeing changes now, for instance.
mm.
And in the next episode, I'm going to be talking to Lavoie, who has had incredible success both in pantomime and on TV as a drag artist, a drag performer. And we mentioned Danny LaRue. He was sort of possibly the first, followed, by many others subsequently, Paul O'Grady as Lily Savage and people like Kerry Dupree. There are many of them, but that
And
really took it in a different direction again, didn't it?
yes, they did, and they took it in a glamorous direction, but also an adult comedy direction. And again, you had to have if it's in pantomime, there had to be a removal of other things into the other into the other roles. Watching Daniel LaRue play in pantomime was quite something.
Yeah.
I mean, but it became an adult activity. I mean, it's quite interesting. I don't know how you feel, but it's quite interesting to see the difference these days between, if you like, the amateur pantomime that's on in every church hall,
Yeah.
every Christmas, to the professional pantomimes. They are quite different, aren't they?
They are. I think you can take that back right the way back to the music hall days because, we talked about Vesta Tilley, but the music hall stars really gave pantomime a lift in terms of bums
Yeah,
on seats in audiences. But what
yeah,
they did
yeah.
was they brought part of their act into the panto, and Danny
Into
LaRue would
pantomime,
do
yes.
that. Danny LaRue was the most amazing female impersonator of famous women, and so he would incorporate that into his
Yeah.
pantomime roles.
And of course, you find that the principal boy increasingly was started to be played by a man,
Hmm.
because and again, bringing their, usually a good singer, a good actor, bringing their act again into the pantomime and put for bums on seats.
I think this is, society changing as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
We talked about the sexualization of principal boys. Views have changed on that now. I think we're seeing a change in having male principal boys for that reason, amongst others. If you look back to the Palladium days in the 60s, some of the biggest shows were, with people like Cilla Black as principal boy. But we're not seeing that now. And we're also seeing a change with more drag performers in
Yeah.
pantomime playing baddies. So are we moving towards gender blind casting, do you think?
Oh, yes. I think we are moving towards gender blind casting in all sorts of different theatre, aren't we? It's interesting that the drag artists of the past, the people like, Danny LaRue and Everidge, etc., were glamorous, but you find that the current drag artists, on the whole, many of them dress like pantomime dames. They, if you look at RuPaul's, his
Yeah.
his drag competitions, a lot of those who go in for those competitions are dressing in many ways like pantomime dames, aren't they?
Yeah, larger than life in terms of what they
Yes,
wear, makeup, and so on as well.
yes.
But they are perhaps in terms of the acting they do, portraying more of a female character. People like Les Dawson and some of the names that we mentioned, never tried to disguise their voice or become more effeminate in any way, did they?
No, they didn't. But I do find that the current drag artists are less recognizable as women than the female impersonators, and maybe the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. They were, even though they were in drag, they were dressing as women, and I think a lot of the drag artists now do not. RuPaul, I remember somebody saying to him about how attractive he looked, and he said, "What woman would ever wear this?" He said, "What woman would ever wear a hair this high and heels this high?" He said, "No woman would ever wear what I wear." Interesting. Yeah, yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. And we've seen a sort of proliferation of almost pantomime dame roles in major movies with people like Dustin Hoffman in
Yeah.
Tootsie. And of course, Mrs. Doubtfire, one of the most popular
Doubtfire.
films, now a West End musical as well. So we're seeing that sort of influence in other areas of theatre, aren't we?
Absolutely, yes. And I think that going back to, whether you were seeing sort of gender blind casting, I think we are in pantomime and many and variety type roles. I think in the theatre, it's more debatable. It's still, I think they're trying hard for gender blind casting, but it doesn't always work. The critics are divided, I think, there. I think the question is, does it add value to the performance? And I think that is a question you can ask in pantomime as well. Does having a female dame add anything to the performance? And in many cases, yes, it does. It's different. It's a different nuanced role, isn't it?
Absolutely. We saw that with Dawn French at the Palladium. We've seen female baddies, in an Abenaza sense. Imagine Theatre did a full drag panto in Corby a couple of years ago. I think as long as the elements are there of slapstick, audience involvement, a good time, goodies, baddies, and all the other things, it doesn't really matter, does it?
No, it doesn't. As long as there are jokes that the adults can understand and the children can respond to, if the elements are there, it's a good pantomime. The elements in many cases are not necessarily whether the characters are who are playing male or female characters are male or female themselves. It doesn't really matter. But I do think you need somebody on the stage who can create that mayhem that kids like, whatever, and that is often now put sideways onto the supporting characters, isn't it?
Yes, and of course Panto survives because it's still entertaining people from all generations, something that the whole family can enjoy together. And there are very few things now that the whole family sits down together for, not even meals perhaps. I think the other interesting thing is, and I'd urge anybody to go and buy the book, It's a Drag is a fascinating read, and it talks about all the things that we've spoken about on the podcast today. The place for cross-dressing in theatre, past, present and in the future, and also perhaps discusses whether or not we will see gender-blind casting in the future. And of course, the book is still available, Janet.
Oh, yes, it's still available.
And what are you working on now?
Right, I've just published a book called Refugee Countess, The 5 Lives of Marianne Stein, which is a biography of a woman who was a refugee, and then she, very musical, lived with Benjamin Britten and his partner for a while, became the Countess of Harwood in Yorkshire, and then eventually married Jeremy Thorpe. And
there's a tale.
There is a real tale there, yes. And I'm just thinking of writing another biography, but I haven't sort of really thought about that fully yet.
Well, listen, it's been fabulous talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Janet. And again, if you want to get hold of Janet's book, it is still available now. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Right. Thank you, Martin.
Once again, thank you for listening and supporting this podcast series. Don't forget to subscribe through your favourite podcast app and spread the word to anybody you know who loves pantomime. Next time, we'll continue the theme when I chat to drag performer, singer and actor Lavoie. So join me, Martin Ballard, next time for episode 108.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.